Hello and welcome back to CST 2120. So in this lecture I'm going to go into a bit more depth about how to use CSS. So I'm going to explain how you can define colors using CSS, talk a little bit about text styling, then explain how you can control the size and position of elements, as well as their borders, padding and margins. And finally, I'm going to talk about how you can use CSS to get a kind of grid structure that can organize your page, which is very helpful when you're going from wireframe to the final website design. So we can start with color. There's 4 ways to specify color in CSS. You can just use color green, which is what I use most of the time because it's really easy. If you want a more precise color, then you've got some options like the RGB value, hue, saturation, lightness value, or hexadecimal code. I'm not going to bother with HSL, but I will talk you through name, RGB, and hexadecimal code. Important thing to note, always use the American spelling without the U, just COLOR to specify colors. So RGB, so this is more of a sort of screen-based approach. Printers have their own CYMK kind of thing. But for the colors you see on the screen are typically a combination of red, blue, and green light. And so you can specify, those 3 things, the red, blue, and the green, and their combinations will produce, pretty much any color you want to use, yeah? So RGB 255, 255, 255 is white, or if you skip the last red, green, and skip the blue, then you end up with a yellow, yeah? These numbers range from 0 to 255, which is the size of a byte, yeah? So if you specify something out of that range, it's just not going to work. Hexadecimals, similar to RGB, except it's more compact. So hexadecimal, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then instead of 10, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, and then you've got 1, O, which stands for 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Yeah, so it's base 16 instead of base 10. But it's nice because you can represent color values more compactly. You typically start with a hash to indicate there's hexadecimal. Yeah. And if you're not sure what the hexadecimal value is for your color, you can use color pickers. This is one from Inkscape, and there's no doubt a sort of Chrome plugin or something similar that lets you pick out the colors you want and get the hex values or the RGB values. You can make your elements transparent or semi-transparent. You add a number to the end of the 3 numbers you specified for the color to specify the transparency, and that number is between 0 and 1. And with RGB, here's the number here. And here again, it's a number between 0 and FF, i.e. 255, which you just append to the rest of the color number. Yeah. And color is obviously very important for website design. So typically going to use CSS to set the background and foreground colors of elements using CSS rules. And the rules are color and background color the most common. Yeah. So let's have a little quick go at that just to show you. So here's my demo. So let's create an element here. So we'll set the background color of the body. Let's create a paragraph. The usual whatever. D2120 is great. So there's our element, right? And now we can style that here. So suppose we set the background color of the body, which is sort of some very common thing you want to do. Background color. Now let's specify it in the different ways, right? So we can just pick a color like blue, violet, or something like that, yeah? We save that, and that's, change the background color to blue, violet. We can also do RGB. No, if we want it red, it'd be 255, 0. And so that turns into red. And then we could, play around with transparency, but I think I'll do that with a paragraph. So that's the background color, and the elements are appearing on top of that, in front of the background. And if we want to change the color of the paragraph, again, we could do color. Let's do the hex value this time. So 00 FF 00. So that should be green. So let's turn it into green. If we want to make that transparent or semi-transparent, we can sort of maybe add a couple of 5s there. And so you can't really see that clearly, but it is semi-transparent, yeah? And that's about it, really. So that's the RGB, the colors, and the hex values, and then we can specify this is like the foreground color or the color of the elements, and then this is here the background color, in this case the background color of the whole thing. But obviously we could make the background color of just the element in this color, and so then it's just applying to the element rather than to the whole body. So next thing I want to cover pretty briefly is text formatting using CSS. And you've got complete control over text styling, right? You can do the font family, font size, and font weight are the most common, as well as, decoration like underlining, italics, and so on, yeah? So I'm just going to do a quick demo of that rather than sort of go over it in detail. I'm not going to cover every kind of style, but just to sort of show you how it works. So go back to this one. I think we'll get rid of that. Let's just do let's do font family, for example. And you see here, with a lot of these rules, you don't have to remember them that well, because you can see here, we've got, all of the rules are sort of listed here, as well as some really good documentation, right? So if I want font style, maybe I want it to be, I don't know, italics, for example. Just type that, right? So italic. So save that. That's made it all italic. And if I want maybe the font weight, make it sort of, 600 or something. So it's made it a bit more bold. And I can change things like font family, whatever. It'll give you a whole bunch of selected families, which kind of works quite well. And then you've got font size being the obvious other one, which is specified in pixels, yeah? So you can see pretty much all of the kind of styling type things that we typically do in Word or something, we can also do with CSS. Now onto some slightly more complicated stuff, which is size and position, yeah? So an HTML element can have a certain width, can have a certain height, as long as it's a block element. So you can't do this as span, because it doesn't have the return mark after it, but you can certainly do it with blocks. So you have these blocks of elements, and you can change their width and height, and you can put them in different places on the page, yeah? So in this case, I haven't applied I've applied the width and the height to these two divs. So here it's got a width, this div 1, background color red, it's got a height of width of 100, sorry, and a height of 40. This one's got a width of 150 and a height of 20, yeah? So it's pretty easy, change the width and height. You could also move the divs around or any other HTML block elements using these rules, and this basically changing the position from static to relative, fixed, or absolute, yeah? And some of these also have these top, bottom, right, and left properties. I'm not going to go into this enormous amount of detail. I'm just making you aware of this more than showing you in detail, because this is used less commonly now, and for reasons I'll explain. And, you're never probably going to remember this just by me telling you in a lecture. You just need to remember that this is possible, and then you can look up the documentation when you need it, yeah? So position static basically means the default. The elements will just follow the normal flow of the document, yeah? And not affected by top, bottom, left, or right. If you want to change the position, you need to use one of these other ones like relative, float, I think, and absolute, yeah? Or whatever the other one, not float, relative, fixed, and absolute, yeah? So relative means normally the browser would put this element in a certain place, but instead it's going to give it an offset, either top, right, bottom, or left offset, depending on what you set there, yeah? You're adjusting the element away from its normal position. So here's a sort of relative example. So this is its normal position here at default by the browser. And by adding top left and making it position relative, we're kind of shifting it away to a different part of the page. Fixed is relative to the viewport. So you may sometimes see menus that, like navigation bars, that are always visible, even though the rest of the page is scrolling. And they're almost certainly using position fixed, yeah? So it'll always just be, it's relative to the window or the viewport, not relative to the page in the document, yeah? Position absolute, it's a bit similar to position relative, except it's relative to the nearest position ancestor, and if there isn't, so if it's in something else that's positioned, then the position will be kind of relative to that thing that's positioned, but more typically you'll use fixed, so it's relative to the whole document, so you can basically put it anywhere on the page, using top, left, bottom, or right, yeah? Float is probably the one you're most likely to use, and this is where you've got a situation where you've got an element and you want the text to kind of flow around it. That's what typically use it for, although people used to use it with layouts, but in this case, these days, probably more this kind of scenario, where I've kind of got a picture of a cat, and I want this picture of the cat to be kind of to the left of this description of the cat. So in this case, I'm floating the cat picture left, and then the rest of it will go around it. If I didn't have float left, all this text would be below it, and I have this tiny picture sort of above it, which wouldn't be quite as nice to look at, yeah? So typically use to kind of stack elements side by side. Again, used to be used a lot in layouts, but again, we got better solutions for that, yeah? And the final one I want to briefly mention is the Z-index. And this is a way in which you can stack elements up on top of each other, just like you would in Inkscape or Photoshop or any of these kind of photo kind of editing things, yeah? So ZX 1, basically I think it's like 0 to 7, I'm not quite sure what 0 does, but 1 to 7 is basically the higher the number, the higher up in the stack the element will be, yeah? So here I've got two divs, right? One with a z index of 1, that's the red one, and the other one, and the green one has z index of 7. So the green one appears above the red one because it's got a higher z index. If we reverse that, then obviously the red one appears above the green one. So let's have a quick look at this. As I said, I don't want to spend ages kind of on this because I think it's less relevant now we've got other ways of doing it. But let's have a quick go, yeah? So let's create a couple of divs just as I had in my example. So let's give these div, okay, and we'll give this one an ID of, just to make it easier to pick them out, div, typing seems to have gone to part at the moment. Okay, so, and that's called div2. Right, it's a couple of divs, easy peasy. And now let's apply some styles to those divs, yeah? So we got using hash because it's an ID member, div1, and then I'm just going to copy that down. So we got div2 there for our styles, yeah? Okay, so let's give it some width, 100 pics, and we'll give it height, 100 pics, and we'll give it a background color, red. And div2 will do width 50 pics, height 50 pics. Let's make it actually wider, that's height. Actually make it 150 so it sticks out, and then height 20 pics or something, yeah? So we can see them whether they're in front of each other. And we'll give that background color green or something, yeah? Nothing too fancy, yeah? Okay. So at the moment, this is the whatever it is, static layout, I think, yeah? Do you tend to forget this stuff a little bit? This is the static layout, which means that it's the default layout, so they're basically one element goes in front of another, yeah? So let's not, you know, go to town on this, but I can, for example, make this position absolute, and then I can do top, I don't know, 5 pics, something like that, yeah? So now it's moved it, or let's make it a little bit more. Let's move it down 15, say. That'll do. So, for example, now it's moved it down 15 pics from the top, yeah? And if I wanted to do the other one that I covered, if I do fixed, that's a sort of particularly sort of interesting one, I think. And then obviously we can kind of move it around, right? And then using the Z index, we can control which one goes top, right? So if we want to make the green one at the bottom, we can make that green Z index 1. And we can give this a Z index of 7 or 2, for example. I think it'll work. So that should be above. Let's try to give that 7. Now why hasn't that worked? Because this is not the reason it's not worked is sorry, excuse me, it's a lighting issue. So this is because it's position absolute as well, yep, because it's static position, so it's not actually moving it up and down. It needs to have positioning that's non-static, yeah. So you can see here now with Z index 7 or even Z index 2 should work. It's still above it. And if we put that to 0, which I'm not entirely sure it does, but it moves it down, and then this one appears up, yeah? So the only other one I wanted to show you was the fixed layout, which is possibly useful. So if we do position fixed, and we're going to need a bunch of junk here. So let me just put in a bunch of junk to make the page long, right? So here we've got a page that scrolls. So you can see here the page, most of the contents of the page is scrolling, but the red one isn't scrolling, and that's because it's fixed, so it always stays in the particular place it is in the viewport, yeah? So that gives you some idea about how to use positioning and size, I think, yeah? Next thing I want to cover are borders, padding, and margins. So the way to understand how these work is to think about an invisible box. So CSS treats each element as if it's got its own little box. So if you want to understand padding and margins, which can be confusing sometimes, just think about the invisible box and try and remember how borders, margins, and padding are applied to different parts of this box. Yeah. So we've got an element, we've got kind of some block elements here and some inline elements. Here, the inline element here has got this kind of invisible box around it, as well as all the different block elements. Yeah. So the border separates the edge of one box from another. The margin is the space between the borders of boxes, and the padding is the space inside the box between the contents of the box and the border of the box. Yeah. So remember this if you don't remember anything from this lecture apart from this. Here we've got the invisible box around the element. The margin is the space between this box and other boxes. The padding is the space between the border of the box and the contents of the box, in this case hello. Yeah. And if you're trying to debug problems with border, margin, and padding, the best thing is to set the border and padding, change the background color, and then you'll be able to see where the different parts of it are. Yeah, set the border and padding and a background color, and then you should be able to see, the borders of the box more clearly. Yeah. Borders have these individual rules. You can control the border style, the border width, border color. But the easiest thing with borders, I find, is just use this kind of combination statement. We have 5 pix solid red, which will put a 5 pixel red border around the element. Yeah. I'll probably do all these together. Padding, similar idea. You can have set padding globally, like one single setting of padding around the element, or you can control individual parts of the padding in one thing. Again, the one I normally would use is this one here, where you have 4 numbers corresponding to the top, right, bottom, and left of the padding of the element. Yeah, and it's the same with the margin. So let's do demos of all those at once, because they're pretty straightforward. So what have we got here? I think we're going to restart this. Let's get rid of this stuff. Okay, I'm just going to have a simple paragraph because it's a bit easier to show this stuff. Hello from CST 2120. Okay, right. So let's now style that up. Yep. Simple. Just got a P. Okay. So save that, and I need to save that. Oh, I need to see it. That's the problem. No, so here we have a very ordinary paragraph. Yeah. So let's start by adding a border to it. Okay. So let's add border. What was it? 5 pix solid red. I think that's right. So there's a border going round the element. Yeah. Let's make it 1 pix, maybe 2 pix. So that's showing you the border and showing you, and so the padding. So let's add some padding so you can see what the padding's doing as well. Let's just do 10 pix at the moment. Yeah. So you can see now when I've added padding, that's giving space between each of the contents of the element and its border. Yeah. And if I want to set padding in a sort of different way, I could do that's top padding. So let's make that 1 pix. Right, doesn't really matter because it's a wide element anyway, but let's make it 30 pix. Bottom, let's make it 50 pix, yeah. And then left, let's make it 20 pix, yeah. So you can see here, now we've got 1 pix at the top. Right, you can't really see because it's a wide element. Bottom, you've got 50 pix, and left you've got 20 pix. And so if I change that to, 60 pix or something, you'll see that it moves across as the padding's increased, yeah. Let's leave the padding just as using a sort of global setting, that's 10 pix, yeah. And now we can then add a margin to that. And the easiest way to see a margin is to add another element, yeah. So let's just create a second element there. So the margin is this space here now, yeah. So if I set margin to 0 pix, for example, then it's got rid of the space between the paragraphs. And then if I set that, I don't know, to 30 pix or something, then we've got the space, that's the global margin. But I could just, suppose I just want the margin top, then let's just put here is margin top for this element is the space here of 30 pix, and here's the space here of 30 pix as well, yeah? So the last thing I want to cover in this, using CSS, is how we can use CSS to create the layout for the page. So remember, earlier on in this course, we talked about wireframes, we're kind of sketching out the layout of the page. And often we're going to have different types of content in different parts, right? We might have a navigation bar across the top, or maybe a navigation bar on the side. Often we'll have, like in real websites, we'll have ads, like maybe on the right or something like that, yeah. And then we'll maybe have, you know, some kind of, if we're doing an email, for example, we might have a place where you can see the emails, and then another window where you can actually view the emails. So every kind of different types of website have different kinds of layout, and we typically would sketch those out in a wireframe, run that past the business, and past the customer, and then eventually we come up with a wireframe that everyone was happy with, and then we need to implement it, and that's what we do with HTML and CSS. Now, historically, we'd use these kind of size and position rules to build our own kind of layout, but these are kind of a bit messy and a bit hacky. So fortunately, they've introduced CSS grids that make it much easier to create a layout that has certain rows and columns, yeah? And so you can create this kind of grid, looks a bit like a table. That said, don't use tables, use CSS grids, they're much more suitable for this. And then we can organize the sort of, basically it makes it much easier to create a wireframe with the different boxes for different contents, yeah? And the CSS grids will be much more rigorous and hold itself together much better than something you stitch together with display, you know, absolute and all this kind of stuff, yeah? So we have these, you know, particular rules here. We've got things like grid template columns, which specifies how many columns there are and how wide they are. Rows specifies the number and height of the rows. And we can do this in pixels, or we can use auto. And usually, unless you've got a reason not to, use auto, because then it'll automatically expand and contract the contents and resize them, which is generally better to have, yeah? And then we can specify row gap and column gap to get the space between the cells in this layout, yeah? Easier with an example, so I'm going to talk through an example, and I'll just show you this example and show you how you can tweak it to explain how it works, yeah? So here, we've got the HTML on the right, yeah, let's talk this through first. So here we've got the HTML on the right, got a nav section with four sort of navigation, or 4 links or whatever, yeah, and then what we might call the main contents, and we've got left, center, right. So left might be, I don't know, an advert, for example, and center could be the main contents, and this could be some kind of clickbait or something like that, yeah. So the nav section, so as explained, we need to do display grid. That's, you know, otherwise it's not going to be a grid layout. We can specify the gap between columns, so that's why we can see the red, because we've got a background color of red, and so the columns of the actual cells have a different styling, but the columns, but you can see through that because there's a gap between the columns. And then this is the most important part, really. It's this part and this part, the crucial bits of grid layouts. Here we're saying we want a column, we want 4 columns. That's what these 4 numbers mean, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it'll automatically take the child elements of this nav element and try and slot them into the 4 columns here, yeah? And auto means that the width of the column will be determined by the contents, yeah? So you can see these are, home and game are almost the same because they've got the same number of letters, whereas registration's quite long and this is a bit shorter, yeah? We could control that and specify the pixels, but in most cases it's better to let it automatically resize it, yeah? Then we got the actual styling of what goes inside each of these columns, each of these cells. And here, like div is the child of the nav, and so we're controlling here the background color, text alignment, padding, and stuff like that, yeah? Then we got our next grid. So we're basically stacking up the grids, because you can see here we could try and engineer it in some complicated way, but it's actually much easier just having a second grid layout below the first, because here we've got 3 columns with different parameters and all the rest of it, yeah? So again, we're using display grid, nothing very complicated there. The interesting change here is I've specified the width of this particular column here. So this will always be 150 pixels, whereas these other ones will expand and contract depending on the size of the page. So let's have a little look at this and play with some of the parameters just to get a feel for it. I'm not sure I've got this one go live actually, so let's do that. So let's just drag this out so we can see it, yeah. Okay, I think that's kind of okay. I might, yeah, not that. Okay, let me just start fiddling with doing the wrong thing here. Let's zoom out a little here. Yeah, okay. Now, first thing, note that the auto columns always change size when I move it. Yeah, up to a certain point when the contents can't fit anymore. Whereas if you look at the left column, it's always the same because I specified that at 150 pixels. Yeah. So that's important. So the column gap's pretty straightforward. Now, if you look here, as I said, it's basically filling in each of these. Each of these is being dumped into this because we've got 4 columns. Yeah. So if we wanted to add, turn this into, for example, if we've got here, we've got our grid template columns. Suppose you want to change this into a 2-row design. We could do 1.5 pixels auto and save that. And then what it's doing is it's dumping this first one, this third one here, below the other ones because there's only 2 columns. Yeah. So if we want to make that look right again, we're going to have to add an extra cell here, and then that gets plonked in there. Yeah. So you can see it's doing, this will be it's filling like left to right and then going down the rows. Yeah, so it does left, that one, then that one, then that one, and finally that one. Yeah. So probably not much to say really, apart from, yeah, we can sort of obviously tweak this, right? Change, so now left and right are much thinner. And we can obviously add more complexity or whatever as required. Yeah. Now, CSS grids are great. They're supported out the box on CSS, but there's also other frameworks that also support grid layouts, and some of these might be a bit better at doing responsive design features, so that, you know, when you sort of resize the page, it'll collapse the menu and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So if you want to get good at this stuff, I'd probably recommend you take a look at Bootstrap or Foundation, which will also do a lot of default styling for your page and make it look more professional. And the frameworks that you're allowed for both courseworks, Bootstrap and Foundation, are allowed for both of your courseworks. Yeah, so don't worry about ever using those in this module. Yeah, a lot of other stuff's banned, but not those guys. All right, so this video has introduced some important features of CSS. Don't try and use size and position to create the layout for your page. Use CSS grids. They're much easier to use, much more consistent in the way they resize and rescale, or use a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation. There are a lot of rules of CSS. I haven't bothered trying to describe all of them. It'd take far too long. You need to sort of use an appropriate IDE that will make suggestions as you type. And what you also get with an IDE is it'll actually explain the suggestions as well. So if I hover over background color, it explains the syntax and all this kind of stuff. It explains what column gap means. I don't know what grid template rows are. It really sort of holds you by the hand and supports you in terms of understanding what you're trying to do. Yeah. As I explained in the last lecture, use developer tools to debug CSS problems. If it's not behaving the way you think, or you're not sure how the CSS selectors are being applied, open up the developer tools, select the elements, and see what CSS is being applied, and fiddle with it. You can even fiddle with it in there if you want to. Yeah, that's not a very good idea because you lose all the changes. This is only a very quick introduction. You need to follow the CSS tutorials to learn more, and you need to practice it, right? CSS is a bit fiddly, but if you're going to be a computer scientist working web development, you're going to use it a lot. So learning how it works is really important, and the way you're going to do that is by practicing it. Yeah. I mentioned this before. I like this Duckett book. It goes through it very nicely, but don't just read it. You need to code up the examples as you go and make sure you get the same results that he does. Yeah. And that's it.